We continue now at the top of Daf Tzadi Chesam at Aleph and Meseches Zevachim. This is Zevachim Daf 98a. We're going to take a look first at the previous Amud, as we were in the middle of a Rashi that will continue on this Amud. On the previous Amud, the Gemara brought the pasuk of Zost HaTorah La'ola V'la Mincha V'la Chatos V'la Oshim V'la Miluim U'la Zevach HaShlomim. And the purpose of bringing this pasuk was because the Gemara had asked, we find that by Chatos Mekadesh B'balua, that means that if the Chatos gets absorbed in another carbon, so then it's Mekadesh it, which means that that carbon takes on that status. Let's say the Chatos is disqualified, it becomes disqualified, etc. So the Gemara had asked, we find that by the carbon Chatos, but Shar Kodshim, by other Kodshim, from where do we know that? And the Gemara now is in the middle of bringing that derivation from this pasuk, which brings all of these various carbonos to be learned from each carbon. We're going to learn something from that carbon. The Gemara had said that what do we learn from Ola? And the Gemara said we learn from Ola, just like Ola is Tu'una Kli, just like it requires a vessel, so too they all require a vessel. And the Gemara said, well, what kind of Kli, what kind of vessel are we talking about? If we're talking about Mizrak, the basin in which one receives the blood, so we have that by Shalmei Tzibur already. By Shalmei Tzibur it says, Vayikach Moshe Chatzi Hadam Vayosem Ba'agonos. And so then, and we'll see that Rashi in a moment, but then the Gemara goes on to say, rather it is the fact that a knife has to be used, that is learned from the carbon Ola. Then the Gemara went on to say that what do we learn from Mincha? The next word in the pasuk is Vila Mincha. We learn from the carbon Mincha, just like Mincha is only Necheles, it's only eaten by Zichrei Kahuna, by male Kohanim, so too that applies by all of the Karbonos. And so the Gemara then said, when it comes to Chatas and Asham, we already know that that's the case. It says, Kol Zocher B'Kohanim Yochlenu. And then the Gemara said, well, if you're talking about Shalmei Tzibur, that also is learned, Me Ribuya Dekra. That's learned from an inclusion in the pasuk, because the pasuk says, Ba'Kodesh HaKodashim Tochlenu Kol Zocher Yochal O. So when we learn from that, it's an inclusion. We learn from that that's true by Shalmei Tzibur, that's eaten by Zichrei Kahuna. And the Gemara then answered Tanohi, and we'll see the continuation of that answer in the Gemara on the next Amud. But we'll take a look at the Rashi Vayosem Ba'agonos. Again, the Gemara said that we already have by Shalmei Tzibur, it says that you have to have basins in which to collect the blood, you have to have a Kli. V'keivan Dehadar Iskish Kulu L'Shlamim. Rashi says the question of the Gemara is, since again they're all compared to Shlamim, Tichsib Bei B'Haikra, which is also written in this pasuk, Zos HaTorah Ola V'la Mincha V'la Chatas V'la Asham V'la Milum V'la Zevach HaShlomim V'yalfinan Minola Kaman B'Shmaitin. We're going to learn something from Shlomim later on in the sugya. We're about to see Ma Shlomim Mefaglin, just like Shlomim is Mefaglin or Mespaglin. The Gemara is about to say, just like there's Pigel by Shlomim, so Hanami Tailif Mi Shlomim. So this issue also, that you have to have a basin to receive the blood, you can learn from Shlomim. Dahasam Nami Shlomim B'Sinai have it, because there also Shlomim was in Sinai. And so then the Gemara said on the previous Amud, Elasak, and rather the derivation from Ola, when we say you need to use a kli, you need to use a vessel, that actually is referring to the sakin, the knife that has to be used, l'shchita, for the slaughtering, la'afuke tzur v'koned d'chlishares ba'inon. That would exclude using a rack or a reed. You can't use that. You need to have a klishares. You need to use a sakin. And then the Gemara said, Maihi, what are we referring to? Meaning, Haiminayu yolif lecho lezichrei kahuna mi mincha. We're learning from mincha that it has to be eaten by zichrei kahuna, by the male kohanim. And then the Gemara said, Ba'kodesh HaKodashim Tochlenu, there's already an inclusion as far as Shalmei Tzibur, so it can't be that we're learning to Shalmei Tzibur Zichrei Kahuna. That's in B'vayikach Korach, that's in Parshas Korach. Ksiv, it's written, V'kodesh yeh l'chod echsib b'seifet dekro yiseru. That part of the pasuk is extra. And l'meil of Shalmei Tzibur v'chivsei atzeres d'chsib b'hu kodesh yu l'Hashem l'kohen. We learn from there to Shalmei Tzibur, as the Gemara said, so it can't be to Shalmei Tzibur, because that we're learning again from that pasuk of B'kodesh HaKodashim Tochlenu. And so the Gemara then answered on the previous Amud that it's actually a machlokas tanoim. Where is the source for Shalmei Tzibur? Iko denafkale mehacha, some learn it from here. Ve'iko denafkale mehacha, and some learn it from here, meaning some learn it from Ba'kodesh HaKodashim Tochlenu, but some learn it from the pasuk that we just brought in the previous Amud of Zos HaTorah La'ola V'la Mincha, etc. And the Gemara now continues the derivation, and this was the whole purpose. The following one was the whole purpose of bringing this, that Chatos, what do we learn from Chatos? Machatos, just like when it comes to Chatos, Mikadeshes Bebalua, again, it sanctifies when it gets absorbed into, let's say, another carbon. Afkol miskadeshes bevalua. So too, that is true when it comes to all of the carbonos. Again, it should be afkol mikadeshes bevalua is the girsa that the Bach has. Again, that applies to all carbonos. And the Gemara continues the derivations. Asham, what do we learn from Asham? Ma Asham, just like by an Asham. Now, the idea of an Asham is that it's a Zocher, it's a male. So therefore, ein shvir v'shilya kadosh bo. The fetal sac and placenta are not sanctified with it because, of course, again, it's a male animal. There is no fetal sac or placenta, but we learn that to the other karbonos. Afkal, so too by the other karbonos, even if the animals are female. Ein shvir v'shilya kadosh bo. Again, the fetal sac and the placenta are not going to be sanctified. And the Gemara explains, kasavar, according to this derivation holds that valdos kodshim b'havayoson hein kedoshim. That when it comes to the offspring of kodshim, it's only when when the birth actually happens that they become sanctified. Again, it's not in the stage of shvir v'shilya. There we don't have that sanctification. And furthermore, according to this derivation, v'don and avshar misha yavshar, we can learn something that is possible from something that is impossible. We're learning from a male animal where, of course, there is no shvir v'shilya. We're learning that to a case of a female animal where there is. That's don and avshar misha yavshar. And then the pasuk had the word miluim, and what do we learn from the miluim? Again, the inaugural offerings. Ma miluim mosrei and bisreifa, just like by the miluim, everything that's remainder, that is all burned. The extra, the noser, is burned. However, ve'ein balechayim b'mosrein, you don't have living animals treated in that fashion and burned as noser. Afkol mosrein b'sreifa, so too that's true again by all karbonos. That which is left over is burned. Ve'ein balechayim b'mosrein, but that does not include balechayim, living animals. And the Gemara continues, Shlomim, what do we learn from Shlomim? And this Rashi just quoted above, Ma Shlomim mefaglin u'mispaglin, just like Shlomim can create and become pigul, Afkol mefaglin u'mispaglin. So too, that's true by all the karbonos. They create and they can become pigul. And Rashi explains, Machatos mekadesh bebolua, just like Chatos is mekadesh bebolua. Rashi notes, V'afagav de mincha namiksiv, even though by mincha it's also written, Kol asher yigab bohem yikdash, anything that touches them is sanctified. To mekadesh is bevolua, there's a concept of sanctification bevolua by absorption, by mincha as well. But itzrich lakushinu lechatos, we need to compare them to Chatos, to mi mincha lo matzah yalfi, because you can't learn from mincha. To ikol amemer, because one could say, lo iskish le mincha ela le'inyan zichrei kahuna, maybe the comparison for mincha is only for Zichrei Kahuna, like we said. That's what we said earlier. Maybe when it comes to absorption just by mincha, which is soft, and therefore there's more absorption. Maybe by other kodshim, that would not be the case. And Rashi continues, just like by the asham, the fetal sac and the placenta are not sanctified, because it's a male animal, as we said. And Rashi continues and says, you can't say by the chaylev and the shtei kloyos of the asham, sha'af shel shlil shebemei of mashma, that would also apply to the chaylev and the shtei kloyos of the shlil that's in the womb. In other words, Rashi's learning when we're talking about the shvir and the shilya not being kadosh, we're talking about the emurim, the sacrificial portions of the shvir and the shilya. Tosas does question this explanation of Rashi, but that's what Rashi says. But in any case, af haboim nekevo, so to the animals which are female, kagon chatas u'shlamim, like the chatas and shlamim, ein shvir v'shilya kadosh behen, the shvir and the shilya are not sanctified. Ve'ein chaylev u'shtei hakloyos shel shlil shebemeyen kareven, and the chaylev and the shtei kloyos of the shlil are not offered. Those sacrificial portions are not offered. And Rashi continues and notes, if you can't learn this from carbon ola, to kolali, because an ola is entirely burnt. And so therefore that statement that by the other karbonos we're going to say ein shvir v'shilya kadosh bo, lo matzi lamemer, you can't make that statement if you're learning from ola. To lav ola medamislu, you can't compare them to ola. Sharei af shara basar eino karev, because when it comes to the other karbonos, you're not offering the rest of the meat either. By the ola, you're offering everything. And Rashi continues and notes, V'achila zichrei kahuna lo yolef mechatas v'yasham, when it comes to the fact that it has to be eaten by the male kohanim, that could not have been learned from chatas and asham, k'di yolef mimincha, like it was learned from mincha. The tik shalach, because then you'd have a question, am I akshinhu lemincha? Why compare it to mincha? Leilfu zivchei shal meitzibur meyasham v'chatas, we should just learn zivchei shal meitzibur instead from asham and chatas. That you can't do. Misham dechsib betarvayu gabe achila zacharim hu kodesh kodashim hi, because over there, when it talks about achila zacharim, by the chatas and the asham, it says it's kodesh kadashim. Hilkach meyasam lo motzi yalfi. Therefore, you can't learn from there. Ilome hakesha de mincha, if you didn't have the comparison to the carbon mincha. And then the Gemara said, Valdos behemos kodshim behavayasan hein kedoshim. The offspring of animals, they become kodesh when they're actually born. Kishenoladim hein kedoshim, meaning they become sanctified when they're born. Velo b'mei imon, not in the womb. V'gamri meyasham, and that's learned from asham. And Rashi continues, the Gemara then said, V'don in Efsher Mishi Efsher, we learn what is possible from what is impossible, meaning Nekevos Mizacharim, we learn a halacha by female animals from male animals where that would have been impossible to have an offspring. Ulagamri lo motzi lemutinu mikachim lahakrivam. And Rashi notes, we can't completely learn from here that you're not even going to offer Nekevos at all as a carbon. That we can't learn. T'chsiv rak kodashecha asher yulach, because there's a pasuk that says rak kodashecha asher yulach. V'yamar Mar, and the master said in Bechoros, rak kodashecha elu hatmuros. When it says rak kodashecha, that refers to substitute animals. And asher yulach, when it says asher yulach elu havlados, that refers to offspring. So clearly there can be offspring of karbonos. Clearly there is such a thing as female animals that are brought as offerings. Umeyasham gamrinan devimei imon mia lo kachi. And again, from Asham we learn that those are not sanctified in the womb. The offspring are not sanctified in the womb. Ela b'hava yasim k'dichsev asher yu. Again, it has to be only when they're born, as it says in the pasuk. And then the Gemara said, Ma miluim mosrein b'sreifa. Just like by miluim, the nosar, that which is left over, is burned. V'lo hayu balei chayim b'mosrein. But there was no leftover living animals. The miluim, by the miluim. Sharei carbon sibor hayu, because those were carbon sibor. V'lo hufreshu shnayim la'achrayas. So you don't have a situation where you're going to have two animals. Sometimes one would separate two animals for achrayas. If one of the animals gets lost, you bring the first one. That you don't have by carbon sibor. V'gam lo avad echad mehem v'hifresh acher tachtav. You don't have a situation where lo avad echad mehem v'hifresh acher tachtav. You're going to separate another one instead. V'nimtza harishon, and then the first one is found. You don't have that situation. So you don't have mosrein by living animals by miluin. So af kol hakachim mosrein b'sreifa ve'in balei chai b'mosrein. So we'll learn by all karbonos, we're going to say that what is left over, what is noser, is burned, but that would not apply to leftover animals, meaning there you could have such a scenario. Shimhayu balei chayim b'mosrein. Let's say you had a living animal as a leftover. Kagon, for example, yachid shefre shnei karbonos la'achrayas. Let's say an individual separated two karbonos because again he wanted to have it for achrayas. Let's say one is lost, he'll bring the other one la'achrayas chovasu to make sure he fulfills his obligation. Shem yovad ha'echad yiskaper b'sheni. If one is lost, he'll use the second one for kapara. Oim hifresh carbon v'yavad, or again the second scenario Rashi just said above. Let's say he separates an animal for a carbon and it gets lost. V'hifresh acher tachtav, so he brings another animal instead. V'nimtza harishon, and the first one is found. V'hikra v'so echad mehen v'sasheni noser. So essentially one is being brought and the second is noser, but there where it's a living animal is noser, ein noser zebisrei. For that kind of noser is not burned. Kidin noser shal miluim, that we learn from the law of noser of miluim. And then finally the Gemara said mefaglim, just like we find by shlomim, it's mefaglim es hanisachim. What that means is it can cause the nisachim, the libations, to be pigul. Shemchishe bezevach, if a person would have the wrong intention by the carbon, af hanisachim mefugalin, even the libations would become pigul. Umishamachi yolef mishlomim, and that's the reason why we're learning that from shlomim. The ikar pigul ksibahu, because pigul is really written by shlomim, so we're learning from shlomim to other karbonos. And the Gemara continues, B'masnisa Tana, in the Braisa it was taught, Mishmei de Rabbi Akiva, in the name of Rabbi Akiva, that Mincha, why does it say Mincha in the Pasuk? What do we learn from Mincha? Ma Mincha Mikadeshes B'valua, just like Mincha sanctifies through absorption, Afkol Mikadeshes B'valua. So to all the karbonos, they sanctify through absorption. And again, in the Braisa derivation we brought above, that was actually learned from Chatos. And so the Gemara says, V'yitzrech l'michtav Mincha, V'yitzrech l'michtav Chatos. It's actually necessary to write Mincha, and it's necessary to write Chatos. Diashmina Mincha, because if it only said it by Mincha, then one would say the Aidi de Rekicha Mivla, since it's soft, that's why it absorbs well, and that's why that's true by Mincha. Maybe it's not true by other karbonos. Aval Chatos Eimalo, by Chatos one might say not. Viashmin and Chatos, and if we only learned it by Chatos, Misham Dekar, because it oozes, it's fatty. Aval Mincha Eimalo, by Mincha I might say not. So Tzricha, that's why it's necessary to teach both. And the Braisa continues again, the derivation we were bringing above from the Braisa. It says in the pasuk chatas. What do we learn from there? Ma chatas eina ba element hachulin. Just like chatas only comes from chulin, it only comes from non-sacred animals. Uveyom, and it has to be brought during the day. Uveyadu hayemanis, it has to be with the right hand. Af kol eina ba element hachulin. Uveyom uveyadu hayemanis. So to all karbonos, they're brought from non-sacred animals during the day and with the right hand. And the Gemara says v'chatas menolan, chatas itself. How do we know this is true? Amar Rav Chisda says Amar Krutz, because the pasuk says v'hikriv Aaron is parachatos asher lo. It says that Aaron is going to bring the parachatos, his parachatos. It means mishalo. It has to be from his own funds, from his own property. Velo mishal tzibur, it cannot be from the community. Velo mishal meiser, it cannot be from money of meiser. That's talking about money of meiser sheni. And biyom, the Gemara now asks, it says that they all have to be biyom during the day, but that we have a general source for that. Mi biyom tzavoso nafka, from the words biyom tzavoso, which applies to all karbonos. That's where we learn that the obligation is during the day. And the Gemara says to that kedei naspa, that was just brought kedei naspa, meaning for no reason. That really enachinami, we really learn from biyom tzavoso. That's not really learned from chatos. The Gemara asks a similar question, biyado hayemonis, we're learning from chatos. This idea of biyado hayemonis, is that really learned from chatos? But midarabba bar bar chana nafka, isn't that learned from Rabba bar bar chana by all karbonos? The Yamar Rabba bar bar chana Amar Reish Lakish, because Rabba bar bar chana said that Reish Lakish said, Kol mokom shenemar etzba ukahuna. Anytime it says etzba, which is finger, anytime it says kahuna, eino elo yamin, it means the right, and so that would apply by all karbonos. And again, the Gemara says kedei naspa, it really was for no reason. Again, there really is a general derivation for that. The Gemara gives another answer in terms of the right. V'iba is saying, if you want, we could say as follows: Savar lok Rabbi Shimon, that this brisa holds like Rabbi Shimon, the Yamar who says etzba lo boy kahuna. If it says etzba, it doesn't need to say kahuna. Etzba alone means the right. But kahuna, but if it says kahuna, but boy etzba, it actually still needs to say etzba, and so therefore by all karbonos, it doesn't always say etzba. It says kahuna. It doesn't always say etzba, and so therefore we don't necessarily have a source for the right hand. That's why the source needs to be the carbon chatos. And the Gemara continues with the derivation from the brisa asham, when it says in the pasuk asham ma asham atzmosav mutarin, just like by an asham the bones are mutar, afkal atzmosav mutarin, so too by all of the offerings the bones are mutar. And the Gemara continues, Amar Rava says, Pshita li, it is obvious to me. And Rashi explains the karer that it oozes mitoch shabasar of, because the meat is fatty, nichnas besocho hashuman ba'omko, again the fat enters in its depths, and chatos, again the pasuk says chatos, and the chatos is ba bayom, that's brought during the day. Tachsib bepar yom kippurim ki vayom hazeh yechaper aleichem, it says bayom over there. Uviyadu hayamonis, with the right hand, tachsib etzba ukuna, because it says etzba finger, and it says kahuna. V'yomar mar la'el, and the master said earlier, kol makam shenemar etzba ukahuna eino el yamin, if it says etzba and kahuna, it means the right. The Gemara asks, but the Rabba bar bar chana nafka, don't we learn right by all karbonos from Rabba bar bar chana? Because initially the Gemara thinks o etzba o kahuna. It has to be written either the word etzba or the word kahuna. You don't have any karbonos where it doesn't mention kohen, it always mentions kohen, and so therefore there's always a source for the right hand. And the Gemara answered, Rabbi Shimon, we're following Rabbi Shimon, beparak beis kahuna boy etzba uvechatas tarvayu ksiv. Again, if it says kahuna, it still needs to also say etzba. It says both terms by chatos. V'lokach hakohen midam hachatos betzbo. It says the kohen takes, and it uses the word betzbo. And Rashi continues, we learn from asham ma asham atzmos of mutar, and just like by the asham the bones are mutar, lasos mehen kalim, to make vessels, to do what you want with them. And Rashi continues and notes, anisha mati, I heard, sharei nechel kohanim, when it comes to an asham, it's all eaten by kohanim. V'noser batzamos l'shayich, he can't say bones are noser, that's not relevant. Noser is not relevant by bones. Ela bedavar hanechel, it's only relevant by something that's eaten, and so therefore memela we understand that they are mutter. Afkal, so too by all karbonos, meaning vafilu ola, even in ola the bones are mutter, even though an ola is entirely burned, but the bones are mutter. And Rashi continues and asks, so miboy lon, we have the following question: if we're learning from asham, because again it's nechel lekohanim, and therefore we understand logically that the atzamas are mutter, so hanami mechatas have a matziyal. If you could learn the same thing from chatas, why specifically are we learning from asham? And so therefore Rashi says, V'nira be'enai, it appears to me lo yeh yisera nafkale ba'asham. We're actually learning it by asham from extra words in the pasuk. It says lo yeh, and those are extra words in the pasuk. T'chsiv be lakoin lo yeh, and therefore from those words we learn it by asham, and that's why we're specifically learning from asham that the bones are mutter. And we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf 98a Amid Beis.